Elijah Cade hasn't spoken to another soul in 8 years, not since the desert took a young soldier he failed to save. Now he hides on the edge of Dry Hollow, haunted by memory, until one moment cracks the silence. A bounty rider strikes a bound Yavapai girl in the open square. Elijah grips his bridle tighter. A dog tag burns in his pocket. This time will he stand. In a land where law rides slow and pain runs deep, one choice could bury his shame or redeem it. And under the scorching sun, blue corn waits for rain. The wind out on Cade land didn't howl. It whispered low and gritty like a prayer too tired to be heard. Elijah Cade moved slow along the fence line. Leather gloves worn to the seam wire looped at his waist, and a hammer swinging steady at his side. His boots pressed into sun-baked dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Every post he mended brought him back to the same image Private Ellis 17, and smiling through cracked lips bleeding into the rocks near Skull Mesa. 8 years hadn't made the image any duller. Elijah could still feel the way the boy's body jerked when the shot hit him. Could still hear the echo of his own voice, too late, too hoarse. Could still remember the searing silence that followed, when his unit didn't wait, didn't look back. Ellis died in a blind corner of a red canyon, while Elijah broke an ankle, and all crawled 4 miles with no water, no weapon, and too much shame. That's where he left his voice. He hadn't said more than a few words since returning to the ranch. Just rode into Dry Hollow one summer morning, skin the color of rusted iron hair, longer than folks thought decent, and eyes that no longer looked men in the face. The Cade spread had once been a tidy place, white-fenced, and rode with squash and beans. Now it was dry-throated land clinging to memory, just like him. Midday sun blistered the ridge when Elijah heard it, the grind of wagon wheels' hooves thick with dust. He straightened, brow wet, squinting toward the west trail. A freight wagon kicked up grit as it rolled toward town, its canopy sun-bleached and sagging. Behind it rode Reuben Danner. Elijah felt the knot in his gut tighten like coiled barbed wire. Danner was older now, but not gentler. Still had that crooked jaw from a cavalry brawl, still wore the faded blue coat he'd refused to surrender when the army cut him loose. Danner now ran under contract freelance bounty hauler, sanctioned by the territory, dangerous as a rattler underfoot. The wagon carried 3 prisoners. One was an older man slumped in iron, another a mustached drunk Elijah faintly recognized as a stagecoach thief, and the third a girl. Barely a woman. She rode behind Danner, wrists bound in front ankles tied under the saddle, hair black as raven wings, skin sun-worn, chin lifted like a blade. Her name hadn't been spoken yet, but it didn't need to be. Elijah knew her type knew the fire that lived behind silence. She was Yavapai, maybe Apache on her mother's side, and she didn't flinch when the townsfolk looked. They stopped by the community well at the edge of town. A few ranchers stood nearby watching. One muttered territorial trespass, they said. She crossed survey lines. Another shrugged. Don't mean she deserves to die in the heat. Danner tugged her reins. Drink, he ordered. She didn't move, just stared at the trough, proud and still. I said drink, he snapped, voice cutting. When she didn't obey, his hand shot out. Elijah flinched. The slap cracked across the square flat and mean. It knocked her back a step. Her lips split. Still she didn't fall. Danner turned to the crowd. Won't obey a damn thing. Should have stayed on her dirt. The girl wiped blood from her mouth with her shoulder. Her eyes, those sharp, storm-dark eyes, met Elijah's for half a second. Not pleading, not begging, just watching. Elijah's hand tightened on his bridle rope until his knuckles turned white. That dog tag in his pocket, the one he hadn't touched in years, pressed against his ribs like it had weight again. A merchant cleared his throat. Let's not have trouble, Cade. But Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood, wind stirring the sweat on his brow. Heart thudding against 8 years of silence. The girl turned her face toward the well. Danner muttered something foul and spat in the dirt. Elijah looked away, but not before he saw the girl's lip twitch. Not a smile, not pain, just endurance. And something in her refusal to break, made a crack in him he hadn't felt since the canyon. Dust swirled around his boots. Tomorrow would not be silent. By late afternoon, the light had shifted less golden, more hard-edged. Shadows stretched long from hitching posts and wagon wheels as Elijah Cade walked his sorrel gelding toward the well. Reuben Danner had staked his crew under the cottonwoods by the livery, letting the horses rest while the prisoners sat roped and silent. Elijah approached with a tin pail in one hand and a calm he didn't quite feel. Danner raised his chin. Well, well, if it ain't the ghost of Skull Mesa. Elijah said nothing, just dipped the pail into the water trough and lifted it slow, the clink of the handle loud in the hush. You fixin' to water the stock? Danner asked loud enough for nearby ears. Didn't think a man who walked away from his own unit knew how to tend anything but grief. Elijah let the insult hang in the heat. He knelt to check his gelding's fetlock voice, quiet but firm, as he replied, Territorial Ordinance 12. Public water for all civilian travelers and livestock. That includes yours. Danner snorted. You quoting law now, Cade? The other prisoners didn't look up, but the girl, her eyes slid sideways toward Elijah. Dirt crusted her cheeks and her lower lip was still bloodied from the slap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elijah's jaw ticked. He dipped the pail again and poured a fresh stream into the trough. Danner chuckled, walking closer, spurs, jingling like a warning bell. Ain't no ordinance stops a man from laying sense into a savage who won't obey. Still, Elijah didn't rise, didn't take the bait. He nodded once at the girl, then turned and led his horse back toward the trail. That night, the wind shifted cooler. Stars flared above the Cade ranch in crystal silence. Elijah moved about the barn with methodical hands, feeding the mare, checking the nails along the stall beams. The quiet had always been his shield, but tonight it felt too thin. Something rustled near the side door. He paused, listened. Then, soft scraping, a sharp inhale. He reached for the lantern and lifted it slow, stepping toward the sound. Near the hay crib, she was on her knees, the girl. Her hands shook, still bound at the wrist by a crude iron shackle loose enough now to suggest she'd picked it. One sleeve torn. Her ankle was swollen. She must have slipped free during the watch change and limped a full mile on bad ground. Elijah didn't speak. He crouched beside her, lifting the lantern higher. Her breathing was ragged, lips cracked, eyes wild but clear. She pointed to her throat, then to the water barrel. He didn't ask why she ran. He didn't scold her. He just grabbed the ladle and dipped it in. She drank in short, shaking sips. When she finished, she slumped back against the beam, eyes fluttering half shut. Reckless Elijah muttered not to her, just to the dry night air. He heard it, then hoofbeats, fast, sharp, closing in. Lantern still in hand, Elijah kicked over the waste bucket near the manure pile and dropped the lamp straight into it. Flames whooshed up bright and chaotic. The barn lit in panic orange, horses stomped. Danner's voice rang out, fire. Elijah grabbed her wrist, tugged her behind the feed crates. This way, he whispered. She didn't argue. He pulled open the rear hay crib, shoving aside an old saddle rack to reveal a hollowed space. In, now. She slid inside, curling tight like she'd done it before. He reached in and cut her wrist tie with the blade he kept tucked in the loft wall. Then he slammed the door and turned toward the front, just as Danner burst in. Where is she? The man barked, half coughing from smoke. I saw her run east. Elijah lied, grabbing a water pail. Must have slipped past you. Danner cursed, turning on his heel and stomping out, shouting to his men. Elijah waited, breath held, as the barn darkened again. Embers glowed faint, but no fire had spread. Just enough to draw eyes. He turned back toward the hay crib and sat down hard on the dirt floor. For the first time in 8 years, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The ghost of Ellis still rode his mind, but now someone else had stepped into the fire with him. And this time Elijah Cade hadn't looked away. By morning, the desert light fell soft over the Cade barn, like an apology. Elijah sat on an upturned crate, fingernails black with ash, a thin layer of soot still clinging to his sleeves. The girl, still unnamed, rested with her knees pulled tight to her chest, in the hay crib, eyes, open, shoulders stiff. He'd brought her bread and jerky at dawn. She touched neither. You're safe for now, he murmured, though he wasn't sure it was true. She looked at him, slow and deliberate, then held out a small cloth pouch from inside her tattered blouse. It was wrapped twice in doeskin, tied with a braided cord. Elijah reached carefully and opened it. Inside were blue corn seeds, small, speckled, precious, and a folded map inked on hide. He spread it on the crate, 3 dots marked with symbols he didn't recognize, all nestled within the borders of his own homestead. He looked up. These springs, they're here? She nodded once. Elijah pulled over a ledger from beneath the saddle rack and flipped to the land survey section. The coordinates matched. Under the Homestead Act, he murmured, sectioned and certified. Springs fall inside my claim. She tapped the map, then pointed to herself. You mean, your people need this water? She didn't answer, but her expression was flint sharp. He leaned back, heart picking up. So, that's why Danner's got you listed for trespass. He's not chasing criminals, he's delivering assets. Elijah stood, pulled the bounty ledger from the shelf, the same one the deputy left him months back. Danner's contract was there 3 prisoners to be transported to Yuma for detainment, but it didn't carry a marshal's seal. No military jurisdiction, just Reuben Danner's signature as a civilian custodian. No military authority, Elijah muttered, just a man chasing fees. She reached for the knife on her belt, then remembered it wasn't there. Her hand curled into a fist instead. Elijah closed the book. There's a way to protect you, legally. She tilted her head, skeptical. He pointed to a corner of his land deed. Section 2289. Spouses of homesteaders are granted automatic residence, civil protection, and freedom from forced relocation. He met her eyes. A marriage would hold. Her nostrils flared slightly. I'm not asking for anything beyond the law, he said. No favors, no burden, just strategy. She studied him, then asked quietly, Is this pity? His voice dropped low. No, it's leverage, and maybe more later, but never pity. A long silence settled between them. She leaned forward, reached for the cloth pouch, and tucked it back into her blouse. Then she looked at the map again, then at him, and nodded once. Elijah didn't smile, he only exhaled. We'll need a witness. County seat's too far, but Reverend Monroe handles filings for the circuit judge. Deputy Torres can stamp the seal. She stood wincing at her ankle but didn't complain. Her back stayed straight. Name, he said gently. She hesitated. Isha. Isha, he repeated. We'll ride at dawn. He turned to gather supplies and she moved toward the water barrel, lifting the ladle herself this time. Outside, the land shimmered hard, dry, and untamed. But the wind had shifted. It no longer whispered of ghosts. It carried the sound of something stirring. They saddled up early. Elijah gave her his old hat. She didn't thank him. She just wore it like she'd always had, to face the sun on her own. As they rode past the ridge, Isha looked back once toward the barn. You trust the law? She asked. Elijah's fingers tightened on the reins. I trust paper more than men. She nodded again. The ride to Reverend Monroe's would take half a day, plenty of time for doubts to surface, but neither of them spoke of backing out. Because when the ground under you is burning, even a brittle statute can be the only bridge left standing, and they were done standing still. The road to Reverend Monroe's chapel wound through low hills and pale-bloomed mesquite, the kind of country where truth had time to settle before reaching another soul. Elijah and Isha rode side by side without speaking much. Her posture stayed proud, but he could tell the ride strained her still swollen ankle. Twice he offered to stop. Twice she shook her head. They arrived at the adobe chapel just after midday. The whitewashed building stood alone, humble, with a rusted bell tied high on a frame of scavenged timber. Behind it, a simple wooden house leaned into a cottonwood grove, where the Reverend tended his garden when not writing sermons. Inside the chapel, dust motes danced in a shaft of light from the rear window. Wooden pews were empty. A simple altar stood at the front, draped in a faded cloth. The air smelled of old hymnals and dry pine resin. Reverend Monroe stooped and, weathered with a crown of white hair, stepped from his office, wiping ink from his fingers. Elijah Cade, he asked, squinting behind his spectacles. Elijah nodded. Need a license filed and a witness. Monroe's brows rose, but he said nothing until Aisha stepped forward beside Elijah. She's of age, Monroe asked gently. I'm 19, Aisha said, clear and steady. Monroe studied her a long moment, then motioned them to the front pew. Give me the names. And a reason you're rushing. Elijah answered first. Homestead protection. Legal union gives her standing under Section 2289. Monroe nodded slowly, then turned to a cabinet and withdrew a fresh form. You'll need a county stamp. Sheriff Torres can do that. As if summoned, the chapel door creaked open, and in walked Deputy Elias Torres, mid-30s, tan hat in hand holster, worn but clean. Saw your horses outside, he said. Heard from the livery what you're up to? Elijah met his gaze. Will you witness? As Torres hesitated, then looked at Aisha. You sure this is your choice? I am, she said. He nodded once. Then I'll witness it. The ceremony was brief, spoken in calm tones, no flourishes. Monroe recited the standard vows, ask no questions that might shame, and let the silence between the couple speak for itself. Elijah's voice was rough but firm. Aisha said her lines without falter. No rings exchanged, just a shared glance and a mutual breath at the end, like two branches leaning into the same wind. Monroe signed the license with a trembling hand. Torres applied the territorial seal from his saddlebag, and a duplicate was placed into a courier pouch addressed for Prescott. "You'll be entered into record by Thursday," Torres said. "That's proof enough." "Thank you," Elijah replied. The moment held a strange peace, fragile but whole. Then the door slammed open. Reuben Danner filled the doorway like a dust storm. Hat tilted back, eyes, sharp revolver drawn and low. "What the hell is this?" he barked. "You think paper makes her yours?" Torres didn't move. "Put the gun away, Danner." "She's under contract," Danner growled. "You're tampering with bounty authority." "No," Torres replied, stepping forward slowly. "You're operating as a civilian custodian, not a marshal. That puts you under Title VI. You raise that weapon in this building, I'll charge you with assault on civil process." Danner scoffed. "Paper won't stop lead, deputy. Then lead better be ready to answer in front of Judge Daniels." Danner stared at Torres, then at Elijah. Finally, he let out a low curse, spun on his heel, and walked out, spitting dust in the doorway as he went. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Monroe exhaled. "Lord have mercy." Elijah turned to Isha. Her shoulders had dropped just slightly. "Do we go now?" she asked. He shook his head. "We stay till the registry's logged. He can't touch you without crossing a federal line." She glanced toward the open door, where the sun carved hard lines into the dirt. "He will come back," she said. "Yes," Elijah said, "but now, so will we." Outside, the wind picked up, and from the saddlebag on Torres's hip, the papers rustled thin pages with iron weight. Back at the Cade ranch, the land stretched out dry and stubborn dust, rising from the hard pan earth, where sparse tufts of sagebrush fought for life. Elijah and Isha rode through the rocky arroyo that cut the southern edge of the homestead, their horses' hooves barely stirring the dry soil. The sun baked their backs as Elijah dismounted beside a narrow creek bed, now little more than a trickle of clear water running over smooth stones. "I thought these springs were supposed to be hidden," Elijah said, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied the gentle curves of the land. Isha nodded, stepping down from her horse with a grace that seemed to tame the rugged ground beneath her boots. "They're sacred, protected, not just by law, but by blood and spirit." He pulled the leather strap of his wide-brimmed hat, lower the weight of years pressing at his shoulders. "We'll need every bit of protection we can get. Danner won't stop at trespassing charges." Together they set to work. Elijah dug a shallow trench, channeling water from the spring into a narrow irrigation ditch that ran alongside the barn's corral. The soil was cracked and dry, but the water fed life into the dirt, softening the earth with slow promise. Isha planted blue corn seeds along the furrow, pressing them gently into the soil, her hands steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "Blue corn," she said quietly, "is our history, our resilience. It will grow here if it's given a chance." Elijah looked at her, a faint smile tugging the corners of his mouth. "Looks like we're both holding on to hope." From the ridge behind them, an old wagon creaked up the dusty trail. The driver was a stooped man with a weathered face. Old Riggs, a prospector, Elijah had helped rescue years before, when a flash flood had pinned him beneath a collapsed cave roof. Riggs nodded a greeting, the brim of his battered hat casting a shadow over bright, knowing eyes. "I heard tell you might be needing some help," Riggs called out, shifting the reins. "Word travels even slow as this land." Elijah approached, wiping dirt from his hands on a rag. "You heard right. Danner's got 4 guns riding with him. They'll be here within 2 nights. Riggs grunted. "That Danner's a snake. But you're no stranger to snakes." Elijah clenched his jaw, recalling nights spent watching the dry moon rise while Ellis's voice haunted him in the wind. "I'm done running." Riggs smiled thinly. "Well, I brought some pickets and wire. Figured you'd want to lay down a line." Together they unloaded the wagon's sturdy wooden stakes, rolls of fencing wire, and a battered set of hand tools. Elijah felt the weight of each piece in his hands, tangible proof they were building more than fences. They were drawing a line in the sand. That evening, Elijah worked late by the corral, welding a crude alarm of tin plates and bells onto a slip gate. Each clang would carry through the dry canyon like a warning bell. His hands moved with purpose, fingers steady despite the aches and bruises gathered over long years. Beside him, Isha prepared a small fire, simmering beans over hot coals, a humble meal but shared in quiet solidarity. Kneeling beside the freshly turned earth, Elijah lifted his head and spoke aloud, voice rough but certain. No more ghosts. Not here, not on my land. Isha reached out, placing her hand over his. Her eyes shone, not with fear, but fierce determination. We stand together. From the ridge, the wind carried their words out over the desert echoes of defiance in a land that had seen too many broken promises. They knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, Elijah Cade felt something stir beneath his skin, not shame, but a slow-burning fire. The desert might be dry, the nights cold and long, but the line they laid tonight would not be crossed without a reckoning. The night settled over Dry Hollow like a thick, suffocating blanket, dark and heavy with the scent of creosote and dust. Elijah Cade crouched low in the trench he'd spent the day digging, heart-pounding beneath a steady breath. The moon had not risen, leaving only the pale wash of stars and the faint glow of distant lanterns flickering like ghostly fireflies. The night was alive. From the ridge came the faint rumble of hoofbeats, slow at first, then rising to a steady drumbeat that echoed across the arroyo. Elijah's hand tightened around the grip of his rifle as he watched the shadows move. 4 riders appeared riding hard, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. Elijah recognized Danner's silhouette in front, lean-coated in dust, revolver low but ready. The bell gate clang shattered the stillness like gunfire. Tin plates jingled and rattled as the gate swung open, weighted by Elijah's crude alarm. The clatter startled the horses. 2 screamed and crashed through the hidden caltrip spikes, buried just beyond the gate hooves, thrashing in sharp agony. One rider cursed as his mount fell hard, flailing. Gunfire erupted, wild, desperate bursts cutting through the night air. Elijah stayed low, aiming not for the men, but for the lanterns they carried. Shots rang out, splinters of light exploding against the darkness, casting flickering shadows over the rocky ground. From the trench, Elijah could see Danner dismount and move toward the barn, shouting orders. His voice was rough with rage. Suddenly, the barn door swung open with a violent crash. Danner stormed inside, boots kicking dust and hay. Seconds later, Elijah felt a heavy hand seize him, twisting his arm. Before he could resist, cold iron cuffs snapped around his wrists, and chains rattled as he was dragged toward a sturdy hitch beam. "You thought you could hide?" Danner sneered, shoving Elijah against the wood. "Time to pay for what you left behind." Aisha was pulled out from her hiding spot, eyes fierce even while bound. She stood tall, chin raised as Danner mocked her. "Here's your prize, the savage who thinks he can protect you." Elijah's breath hitched, but inside his sleeve his fingers brushed the tape covering a small knife Aisha had slipped to him earlier. Danner gloated, turning back to jeer. "Ellis would have died anyway. You're just too scared to stand." Elijah's heart beat harder. The knife gleamed faintly under the barn's dim light. With careful strength he wrenched the bolt of his chains with a quick practiced twist. The iron link snapped open. Danner's eyes narrowed as Elijah broke free, spinning with the weight of years and regret behind his every move. Outside, Isha whistled sharply, 2 quick piercing notes that cut the tension like a blade. Old rigs waiting beyond the ridge pulled a heavy gate cord. The latch released, and with a thunderous crash, railroad ties slammed down, scattering the riders in a chaotic scramble. Horses reared, riders cursed, and the night air filled with the sounds of desperation. Elijah seized the moment. Swinging a worn hoe handle with practiced swings, he smashed into Danner's revolver hand. The gun clattered to the ground, spinning away in the dirt. Danner staggered back, breathing hard, anger and surprise flashing in his eyes. "No more killing," Elijah said, voice low and unwavering. "Not here, not now." The crack of a distant horse's hoof brought a new sound. Deputy Elias Torres riding fast with 3 possemen. They galloped into the chaos, guns holstered, but hands ready. Torres called out, voice steady. "This ends tonight. Everyone put down your weapons. You're under arrest for arson, assault, and kidnapping under revised Statute 99. Riders ceased fire, faces tight with frustration and defeat. One by one, they were rounded up. Elijah stepped toward Aisha, voice gentle but firm. "You're safe." She nodded, but her eyes searched the shadows still lingering beyond the barn. Torres walked over, tipping his hat to Elijah. "Good work. You held your ground." Elijah looked out at the dawn bleeding over the hills. For the first time since Ellis fell, the weight in his chest lightened, not gone, but shifted. There would be more battles ahead, more reckonings. But tonight, under the quiet sky, justice had a voice, and Elijah Cade was ready to listen. The firelight faded with the coming day, but the embers in their hearts refused to die. The dawn broke over Dry Hollow with a brittle chill that cut through layers of dust and silence. The night's gunfire had left the earth scorched and cracked, but beneath the hardened surface a pulse was rising. Elijah Cade stood near the corral, the morning sun painting his face with a weary resolve. His fingers still throbbed where the hoe handle had met Danner's gun hand, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight lifted from his chest. Isha moved beside him, her steps sure despite the lingering ache in her ankle. She carried a worn leather pouch, the blue corn seed safe within a symbol of hope, pressed close to her heart. The barn doors stood open, the fresh air chasing away the remnants of smoke and fear. Old Riggs was already at work near the newly fortified gate, adjusting a length of rope connected to a heavy wooden beam. He nodded as Elijah approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Got the main trap set," he said gruffly. "Should catch anyone thinking to sneak back under cover of darkness." Elijah's eyes scanned the line of pickets driven deep into the ground. "Good. We'll need every edge we can get." Isha set down the pouch, kneeling by the rows of freshly planted blue corn. "This land will remember what we've done," she said softly, "and so will the springs." Elijah knelt beside her, brushing dirt over the seeds with care. "And so will we." The morning passed in measured quiet. Horses grazed nearby, the soft clop of hooves, mingling with the rustle of the desert breeze. For a moment, the world felt fragile but full of promise. Then the distant sound came, the hurried clatter of hooves racing over hard earth. Riders, Elijah muttered, rising. Torres must have sent word. Isha stood beside him, hand tightening on the leather pouch. Together they watched as a small posse of deputies led by Deputy Elias Torres came into view. Their faces were grave, their movements purposeful. Torres dismounted swiftly and approached Elijah. "We've got them rounded up in the valley," he said. "Danner and his men are in custody. 9 charges, at least arson, assault, kidnapping. The judge will want a full report." Elijah nodded, relief and exhaustion mingling in his chest. "Thank you, Elias. You kept your word." Torres glanced toward Isha's, respect clear in his gaze. "You're safe now. No one will lay a hand on you." Isha's lips curved in a faint smile. "Thanks to him." Elijah glanced toward the cabin where the seeds and the map lay waiting. "This is just the beginning." The deputies led the prisoners down the dusty road toward Dry Hollow's small jail. As they passed, townsfolk watched in silence, some with shame, others with wary curiosity. The weight of Danner's tyranny was lifting, but the scars he left would take longer to heal. Back at the ranch, Elijah and Isha worked side by side, reinforcing the fences, tending the fragile seedlings, and preparing for the hard days ahead. The stolen years of silence and regret still lingered, but they no longer held dominion over them. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Elijah found himself alone on the porch, fingering the dog tag he'd carried for 8 years. A small, cold reminder of Ellis and of the past he was slowly making peace with. Isha came to stand beside him, quiet but steady. "We'll build something here," she said, voice soft but unwavering. He looked at her, the first real warmth breaking through the dust on his face. Not just a fence line, a home. And beneath the fading light, the blue cornstalks swayed gently, promising life after long drought. In Dry Hollow, the reckoning was far from over, but for Elijah Cade and Isha, the hardest battles had already begun, and this time they would face them standing together. The wind carried their silent vow across the cracked earth, truth spoken not with guns, but with quiet, unyielding courage. The summer sun bore down on the open-air courtroom like a judge's heavy gavel, merciless and unyielding. The makeshift benches fashioned from rough-hewn planks creaked beneath townsfolk, gathered under the hot Arizona sky. Dry Hollow was no place for secrets, and word had spread fast. Elijah Cade and Isha stood ready to face the law, not as fugitives, but as rightful claimants. Circuit Judge Daniels sat on a raised platform beneath a canvas awning, his weathered face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes scanned the crowd with quiet authority, but his expression betrayed the fatigue of a man who had seen too many disputes over waterland and honor. Elijah stood tall beside Isha, his boots planted firmly in the dust. The years of silence had sharpened his resolve, the weight of regret pressed behind steady eyes. The first witness was old Riggs, the prospector whose weathered hands had helped fortify the ranch's defenses. He spoke plainly, voice gravelly with age. "I was there when Danner hired 4 guns. Offered $50 a head for any escaped property. Said he'd bring 'em back dead or alive, Riggs said, eyes flicking to Danner's absence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Next came Deputy Elias Torres, who presented the marriage license stamped and signed by Reverend Monroe and registered at the county seat in Prescott. He laid out the details clearly, then pulled from his satchel a folded parchment, Elijah's deed to the homestead, including the survey map Isha had carried with her. The springs fall squarely within Mr. Cade's claim, Torres explained. Mrs. Cade has every right to be here under territorial law. Isha stepped forward calm but resolute. The land is as much mine as his, she said softly. These waters have nourished my people for generations. Judge Daniels leaned forward, voice measured but firm. Is there any challenge to the validity of this marriage or claim no one answered? The courtroom held its breath. Outside, the adobe walls glistened faintly with dust, stirred by a desert breeze. But inside, the weight of truth settled like cool shade. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the rear entrance. The crowd turned as Reuben Danner strode into view, his coat dust-streaked eyes blazing with fury and humiliation. His voice rang out sharp and bitter. This is a sham. Paper won't stop the law I serve. Those waters are federal property land surveyed by the Army. I have orders to reclaim trespassers. Torres stepped forward, hand resting on his holstered revolver. Territorial law recognizes homestead claims once registered. Your bounty contract grants you no authority here. Danner sneered, spitting on the ground. We'll see what the courts say in Yuma. I'll have those springs back. Judge Daniels raised a hand, silencing the outburst. This court will hear no threats. The trial continued with careful deliberation, witnesses for the prosecution and defense presenting records testimonies and territorial statutes. When the sun dipped low, the judge finally spoke. Based on the evidence presented, the marriage license, the homestead claim and testimony, the arrest of Elijah Cade and Aisha on trespass charges is lawful under territorial statute. He paused, eyes meeting theirs. Reuben Danner's bounty hunting privileges are hereby revoked. He is to be bound over to the Yuma Territorial Court on charges of arson, assault, and kidnapping. A collective exhale swept through the crowd. Elijah's lips twitched with the faintest smile. Isha squeezed his hand. Judge Daniels' continued, voice softer. And while restitution may be considered in other cases, Mr. Cade has declined compensation, requesting instead the seeds of peace and the hope that this land may grow beyond old wounds. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of justice lingering like the fading sun over the hills. Outside, neighbors approached Elijah and Isha, cautiously, their faces touched with a new respect. Whispers of change stirring the dry air. Elijah lifted his gaze to the horizon where the first stars blinked awake. This land's more than dirt and water, he said quietly. It's a promise. One we'll keep. Aisha nodded, eyes shining. Behind them, the courthouse stood silent, but for the first time, its doors opened wide for truth. The long fight was far from over, but in the court of sun and sand, Elijah Cade had finally found his voice. The night wrapped the valley in calm, but beneath the quiet, the seeds of hope had taken root, ready to bloom when the rains finally came. The monsoon season arrived like a long-awaited blessing, softening the cracked earth beneath Dry Hollow's stubborn skies. The desert, once brittle and gray, began to pulse with quiet life, each drop of rain a promise of renewal. Elijah Cade stood on the porch of his rebuilt barn, the rough-hewn timber smelling of fresh pine and hard work. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over rows of blue corn shoots poking through the softened soil. Neighbors he hadn't seen in months paused by the fence, their faces etched with cautious hope, exchanging nods and small smiles. Isha moved beside him, hands dusted with earth, her gaze steady as she planted seeds along the newly tilled ground. Ellis Field, Elijah said softly, gesturing to the wooden marker near the green shoots. He stood when it counted. So will we. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. This land will remember. The dog tag Elijah had carried for 8 years was folded carefully in his palm, a cold, familiar weight. Today he slipped it beneath the marker, burying it not as a token of sorrow, but as a seed of peace. The work wasn't easy, and the shadows of the past still lingered. Town whispers had quieted, but not vanished. Reuben Danner's threats still hung in the dry air like dust storms on the horizon. But Elijah and Isha faced it all with ironclad resolve and a growing community rallying quietly behind them. Neighbors arrived that afternoon, bringing tools and provisions, helping mend fences and patch the barn's roof. The barn dance scheduled for next month was whispered about with newfound excitement, a chance to reclaim more than just land, but also hope. Elijah watched as children chased each other across the sun-baked yard, their laughter a fragile but joyful echo. "You ever think about leaving this behind?" Aisha asked one evening, their shadows long in the fading light. Elijah shook his head. "No. This place. It's where the past meets the future. I'm done running." She nodded, warmth in her eyes. "We'll build something here, something worth fighting for." The monsoon rains came steady and sure, drumming on the tin roof, washing dust into muddy rivulets, coaxing green from the dry soil. Elijah and Isha stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the field, watching the sprouts sway in the wind. "This is more than land," Elijah said. "It's a second chance." She squeezed his hand, quiet but certain. "And we're ready." That night, as stars blinked against the dark velvet sky, Elijah heard the soft ringing of the porch bell, neighbors coming for supper, bringing stories and laughter. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. Elijah smiled, heart lighter than it had been in years. The ghost of Ellis was finally laid to rest, not in silence, but in the promise of life that still pushed through cracked earth and broken hearts. Dry Hollow was no longer just a place to survive, it was a home. And under the vast Arizona sky, Elijah Cade's honor was reclaimed not by gunfire or grudges, but by courage, law, and the steadfast bloom of green shoots. Ever chose truth over fear? Tell us below and ride along by subscribing for the next frontier reckoning.